UNFPA's annual flagship report, State of World Population in the Asia-Pacific region. This year's report, titled Against My Will, focuses on harmful practices that devastate millions of women and girls around the world. Primarily child marriage, female genital mutilation, and gender-biased sex selection linked to son preference and an extreme bias against girls. Our report launch and first session last week focused on child marriage. Today, we will discuss son preference and gender-biased sex selection. As the report highlights, gender-biased sex selection is a manifestation of gender inequality and an extreme form of gender-based discrimination. Whether it is through prenatal or even preconception sex determination and selection, or whether it's through postnatal discrimination and neglect, this harmful practice reflects the lower value given to girls and women. The fact that men and boys continue even today to be more wanted and valued than women and girls is both an individual tragedy and a collective crisis. A tragedy both for all the missing women and girls, more than 140 million globally, most of them in Asia, and also for the communities and societies impacted by this absence. Sex selection and the skewed sex ratio at birth results in a so-called marriage squeeze, whereby millions of men, many of them poorer and with less education, are unable to marry. It also contributes to increased crime and instability and the trafficking of women and girls. Gender inequality exists in every country and society, but sex selection is concentrated in just a few countries in Asia, among them India, Nepal, China, and Vietnam. There are also signs of an imbalance in the sex ratio at birth in Bangladesh and Pakistan. This crisis, and it is a crisis, is the outcome of three key and intersecting factors. Declining fertility, which leads to sex selection to ensure that sons are born. Availability of technology, which makes it possible to do so. And strong son preference, which makes it desirable to have sons rather than daughters. And we have seen such rapid socioeconomic change across the Asia-Pacific region, including rapidly expanding availability and use of new reproductive health technologies. Access to prenatal sex selection and determination is part of this trend. But ultimately, the key driver of this crisis are the harmful social and gender norms, including strong son preference in favor of boys. These persist across diverse cultures and are deep-rooted and very hard to change. Very few countries globally have been able to has seen the sex ratio at birth return to normal. In a context of rapid modernization and economic growth, it did so by implementing a combination of legislative and social policy measures, such as ensuring equal property and inheritance rights, investments in girls' education, and public campaigns and awareness raising. As the Republic of Korea's experience shows, a comprehensive approach is needed, which includes promoting gender equality more broadly, as well as realizing women's rights, including their sexual and reproductive health and rights. Countries that are currently tackling son preference and sex selection must prioritize certain key actions, and these include eliminating a gender-based discrimination in law and policy, including the need to ensure women's economic rights, ensuring access to services including education and sexual and reproductive health services for women, providing incentives to families and couples to invest in girls, ensuring access to social protection for parents as they age, and campaigns to increase the value of women and girls. Legislating to ban the use of technology for sex selection is necessary to send a strong signal. But this must not come at the expense of restricting women's reproductive rights. The State of World Population report stresses 3 key human rights principles that can bring real change and real results for women and girls. And the first is respect. We must foster respect for women and girls by changing entrenched cultural attitudes and practices that dehumanize them and regard them as commodities. This means identifying, targeting, and disrupting root causes of inequality and respecting girls' autonomy and right to self-determination. The second is protect. We must protect women and girls by enacting and enforcing laws and against harmful practices, even as we work with parents, families, communities, and entire societies to change attitudes and norms, including the norms that underpin harmful practices like son preference and gender-biased sex selection. The third one is fulfill. Governments must fulfill the obligations under human rights treaties that require the elimination of harmful practices. And this includes eliminating all forms of discrimination. In conclusion, and to summarize what I just said, unless we achieve gender equality and address and make sure that women can enjoy their human rights, we will not be effective in the fight against harmful practices. That is absolutely key. And I would like to thank you again for joining us today for this important discussion. And it comes, of course, as the world continues to face the challenges of COVID-19, which has resulted in increased gender-based violence amid lockdowns, increased child marriage and female genital mutilation, and an increase in unintended pregnancies, which further feeds into gender-biased sex selection. And let us do all we can to help and end harmful practices against women and girls. Each of us can and should play a part. And what we do now will shape the lives and future of millions of girls and women in the years ahead. And our webinar is one step towards that. And I'm really looking forward to listen to the expert panel that UNFPA has put together for today's launch. So thank you very much for listening and joining us. And back to you, Roy.
Thank you so much for that, Bjorn. So before we turn to the panel with our special guests, let's first watch a short video from South Korea. It's a story of true transformation. Can we have the South Korea video, please? Thank you.
Why you invest for the girls? The girls is useless when they getting married. During the 1980s and 90s, I have many friends who are getting married those days. Even though they are very independent and talented women, most of them forced to having a boys.
1980s was a time when South Korea experienced rapid economic and social development. They introduced the fetal sex screening technology in Korea. Just imagine that you don't want to have many children, like 1 or 2, but you still have some preference.
The abortion was illegal by the law, but reality, the abortion is very much common. Group started to review their own, condition and situation. they decided one of the biggest issues is we have a problem in our own family.
So South Korea used to have a very, very strong women's movement and women's groups, which started mainly from 1980s, centering on working to eliminate violence against women. This led to later in 1990s, 2000, many other movements in society where they demanded for the legal change. And this legal and policy change also had supported overall eliminating the son preference in South Korea. To end the son preference and actually broader efforts of achieving gender equality in South Korea has affected the current feminist movement in Korea.
The young generation, they can take over and they can, use their own technology and their own new ideas, and then they can actually change all things.
Thank you for that. Now we turn to our special panel and three fantastic guests. And for that, I turn to my colleague, Ingrid Fitzgerald. Ingrid, over to you.
Thank you so much, Roy, and thank you so much, Bjorn, for those opening remarks. My name is Ingrid Fitzgerald, and I am the Gender and Human Rights Advisor here in the Regional Office for UNFPA in Bangkok. And I'm very pleased to welcome everybody to this, our second panel discussion on harmful practices for the launch of the State of the World's Population Report 2020. So as we've just heard from Bjorn and seen in the Korea example, gender-biased sex selection is a complex phenomenon. It's rooted in gender inequality and driven by declining fertility rates, access to technology, and strong son preference. And it manifests in millions of missing women and girls and a slew of harmful consequences. And it exists in a handful of countries in our region. Overall, at national level, the sex ratio imbalance has actually been narrowing in some countries, such as China and Vietnam. But at the same time, it's spreading to areas where it was not previously apparent. It crosses borders, including when women travel across borders to access sex selection technologies and when marriage and trafficking takes place due to a demand for wives for men who are unable to marry. And it spans socioeconomic groups. Commonly, it is found in better off households, at least initially, but then spreads to poorer households when technology becomes more affordable and accessible. It can result in violations of women's reproductive rights when women are forced to undergo abortions or to continue to bear children until they have a son, in gender-based violence when women are unable to bear sons, and in discrimination when parents of daughters are socially excluded and marginalised. Legislation to prevent sex selection and use of technology to determine sex is not sufficient alone to stop the practice, though, given the strong incentives to bear sons, and can in practice result in restricting women's access to reproductive health services. But as we've just seen in this Korea example, it is possible to change this harmful practice with concerted effort and a comprehensive approach. And we will discuss this further with our panel today. So let me turn now to our panel and I will introduce each of our speakers and we'll have several rounds of questions followed by questions and answers from our online audience watching live on Facebook and YouTube. So let me start with Professor Li Shuzhou. Li Shuzhou is Professor of Population and Development Policy Studies at Jiaotong University and Consulting Professor at the Morrison Institute for Population and Resource Studies, Stanford University. His research focuses on population and social development and public policies in contemporary China, including population policies and development, gender imbalance and sustainable social development, aging and health, migration and integration. So Professor Li, let's start with you. The sex ratio at birth appears to have stabilized or even fallen slightly in China in the last couple of years. What is the reason for this shift? And what do you anticipate is the likely impact and trends of sex ratio imbalance in China in the coming years?
Okay, thank you, Ingrid, for your nice introduction. And it's a great pleasure to join this special panel. Yes, as you mentioned that China just see a very sharp decline of sex ratio at birth. Last year, the national figure is around 110. So just remember that 40 years ago, when the China just started opening up, so the SRB started rising around 108. So from year 2000 to 2010, so it's fluctuated around 120. That's very, very high. And starting from 2010, the SRB start declining, almost 1%, 1 point per year. So right now we saw the 40 year of sex ratio transition from 108 to 110 again. I think there are a couple of important factors that affect the sex ratio transition. Of course, the number one will be the Chinese government action, special actions, including campaign and Care for Girls campaign, and also specific action to crack down to what we call two illegalities. That means illegal sex determination of fetus and also the illegal sex-selective abortion. So this is the number one issue. Number two, I think what I called is a development effect. That means that over the last 40 years, especially last 10 or 20 years, like China has experienced a rapid socioeconomic development. I would say that rapid modernization, industrialization, urbanization, and a massive out-migration of young adults from rural to urban area. And also we have established and deepened what we call the social system, including social security system, social pension system. So that is including healthcare, pension, and education, employment, childcare, and also minimum living subsidy and support system. So this is number two. Number three, I think the important thing is that over the last 5 years, we do see a very, very national campaign and a special action called the Target Poverty Elevation Program. So this is all to try to eradicate what we call absolute poverty. So all these kind of specific actions and the development issues all help to promote the gender equality and also to try to promote gender mainstreaming. I think these are very, very key issues that underline this, what I call the sexual ratio transition in China. But what is the future? It's very, especially for the next 5 to 10 years, because by government planning, the SRB should decline to under 110 by 2020. So we already achieved this target last year. So what may happen in the next 5 to 10 years is hard to tell. But I can say that it's probably very unlikely to get back to normal, to the 105 or 106 in 5 years, because based on the experience from other neighboring countries and regions, for Chinese society, it's almost hard to get to the 105 or 106 like Hong Kong or Singapore. But we do see a lot of interesting and important trends that may work, so can keep the SRB underlying under the 110. I think the first one is about China's coming to the aging society and urban society. So in the urban and aging society, women's and girls' values and status are more likely or much more easily accepted and realized by society and also by the families. That's the number one. The number two, I think, is a low fertility issue, because China adopted a universal two-child policy around the year 2016. So the government tried to increase the number of births, but actually the number of births declined every year. So my figure shows that in 2016, the annual birth was around 17 million. Last year was about 14 million. So it's declining. But at the same time, the proportion of parity to births is increasing, and SRB has been declining. So I think that a small family is very hard to change in the future, following the other Eastern societies like Korea and Japan. So I think that's also one important factor to try to contribute to the continued lowering the SRB. Of course, in the long term, with the rapid development in China, the gender equality and the gender mainstreaming is a national policy of China. I think that all may help. So it's very hard to know when we can get back to what I call the very normal, around 105. But even if getting back to 105, it's still far away from the real gender equality. So I think that in the short run, we may continue keep it under 110. That's acceptable by the Chinese society and the government. But in the long run, we need to work harder and harder to try to get it back to normal. Thank you, Ingrid.
Thank you so much, Professor Lee, and thank you for highlighting the changes that have happened in China over the past couple of decades of the sex ratio imbalance and some of the policy interventions that have helped to correct the sex ratio imbalance. And we'll come back to this over the course of the panel today. So I'd like to now turn to our second panelist, Dr. Kuo-Tu Hong. Dr. Kuo-Tu Hong is the founder and director of the Institute for Social Development Studies, ISDS, an independent research organization located in Hanoi, Vietnam. Before founding ISDS, she worked for the Institute of Sociology at the Vietnam Academy of Social Sciences and for UNDP as a gender specialist. She's currently chair of the Gender-Based Violence Prevention and Response Network in Vietnam, GBVNet. Her major fields of study include gender, sexuality, and social inclusion. And Dr. Hong, in Vietnam, as in China and India, there's been strong government buy-in and action to address gender-biased sex selection. In Vietnam, this started very early, even before a strong skew in the sex ratio was even evident. Why do you think Vietnam responded so quickly to gender-biased sex selection? And what have been some of the success factors in addressing son preference in Vietnam? Dr.
Hello,
Hong?
can you hear me? Okay, yeah. Thank you, Ingrid, for your introduction. Hello, everyone. Yes, it is the very, very interesting question. You know that in Vietnam, like in China, in some other country, son preference as well as the low fertility and widely accessible to technology are the factor contributing to the imbalanced sex ratio at birth in our country. Among those factors, son preference is the most is the primary one that's promoting the sex selection practice among many couples in Vietnam. Actually, our government from the lesson that we learned from South Korea, from China, take action very early with a lot of policy and the intervention to increase people awareness about the consequences of the imbalance of sex ratio at birth in Vietnam, and pointed out the primary factor is the extreme son preference. A lot of campaign and the intervention project to improve awareness, and also combining with the project and program in terms of promoting women advancement and, and gender equality. But honestly speaking, if you meet the people in Vietnam now and you ask about their perception about son preference and about the sex ratio at birth, they can tell you can see that they have very, very high awareness. They understand the consequences. They know that the daughter and son must be treated equally. But in practice, son preference is still persistent, and there's still a lot of practice to detect the sex of the future baby, and there's follow up with the sex selection practice like abortion, sex selective abortion. The reason why sun preference is so persistent in Vietnam is because of several reasons. The first, Vietnam is very strongly influenced by Confucianism, and a patrilineal family system exists long time ago, and the patrilocal living arrangement also widely practiced. So after marriage, women have to move to their husband family and live there. So all parents relies only on the son. So for them, son is very important as the for their future. That's why son plays very important role as a caretaker for their parent when they get old. And the second important factor is related to the belief that son is the one who continue family line and the one who worship their parent and their ancestor when they pass away. So those who have no son believe that they will be hungry in the other world. So people is really afraid of that future. And another important thing in our society now, even among the very wealthy people, that son enhance the parent status in the society. You have everything. You may have a good career. You may wealthy people, but you have no son. People consider you as failure or is an imperfect person. So that's why many people, especially those who have better off condition, they strive for having son. And given the availability and affordability of the sex selection technology in Vietnam, I have to say that gender biased sex selection in Vietnam still widely practiced. And nowadays, with the advancement of technology like IVF and embryo technology, some people even sought out to such a technology in order to have at least a son. Yes, so we see that our government also realized that changing the son preference attitude is the most challenging one among the other intervention that we are following so far.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hong. And I think you've really highlighted both the persistence of son preference and some of the reasons for that, which are specific to Vietnam. And of course, some of those reasons are shared and common with other countries, but also the impact of technology as it evolves and changes. So it becomes easier and easier for people to practice even preconception sex selection. So let's turn now to our third speaker. Professor Ravinder Carr is Professor of Sociology and Social Anthropology at the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi and a visiting scholar at the Maryland Population Research Center at the University of Maryland. She has worked extensively on issues of gender inequality, reproductive technologies, and the social consequences of skewed sex ratios. Her work with UNFPA has also included technical papers on various aspects of gender-biased sex selection, including the role of class and education, the marriage squeeze, and crime rates, and most recently, a study on changing parental attitudes and shifting value of daughters. So, Professor Carr, your research on GBSS in India shows just how complex the phenomenon of son preference is. Can you tell us a little bit about the socioeconomic class and aspirational nature of gender-biased sex selection in India? And in terms of consequences, does son preference really result in increased crime and a serious marriage squeeze?
Dr. Carr, you to unmute. Thank you.
Thank you, Ingrid, and thank you for having me on the panel. You have 3 questions for me, so I'll attend to them briefly. I think there is a lot in common with China and Vietnam, and especially Dr. Hong highlighted all the structural features which we share in terms of son preference. I think we have to look at structural conditions, but we also have to look at social processes and social conditions. So the political economy of son preference and daughter dislike or daughter aversion is extremely important. And here, the research that I did focused on fertility shaping strategies as well as family shaping strategies. Well, they are similar in a way, but what I'm highlighting is that both these strategies are also class mobility strategies. So, as you mentioned, the role of the aspirational classes, people who want to move up, become secure, become part of the what I call the stable middle class. And so this is a class that would like to have a smaller size of the family. So everyone wants really two children in India now, a girl and a boy if possible. And if to ensure, especially the sons, is when sex selection is indulged in, or gender biased sex selection happens. So what these classes are trying to do is to make the size of the family smaller, but also ensure a certain sex composition of the family. Now, if for fortuitous reason, people end up having two sons in their first two births, they're just fine with it. They're not going to go ahead and try for a daughter. But in case the first child is a girl, then they want to make very sure that the second child will be a boy. In fact, the society in many of the states is turning to a one-child family and then wanting that one child to be a son. So what we are looking at is that there is intervention in terms of using sex determination and sex selection technologies, even at the first parity. And but my focus was on, what is the role of these aspirational classes? And I looked at what I call the emerging middle class. Now, that's a class of people that are not poor anymore, but that are not really very secure in the middle class. And that class was very huge in number in India and growing as poverty decreased. And we can map it, and that's what I did, that as the size of this class grew and the sex ratio worsened. So my data work showed me that each 10% increase in the size of the emerging middle class worsened the sex ratio at birth by 0.7%. But there is also a silver lining to this, in the sense that as people's circumstances improve further, they enter what I call the stable middle class, then they tend to sex select less. But we have to remember that, there's a very important factor that has a role to play in this, and that is the role of women's education, the mother's education, women's education in general. And I'll be coming back to that theme in one of your later questions that you had shared with me. But my data showed me that a 1 year increase in female education improves the sex ratio at birth by 1.7 points. So what is this pointing us towards? What this is pointing out towards is that economic growth needs to be spread more widely among the classes. That means as people's economic circumstances improve and they feel secure in the middle class, they tend to sex select less. That means they tend to treat their daughters and their sons more equally. But that does not happen by itself. It happens when people also, the educational levels improve. You might become very rich, but you will still sex select because you have not had the education which makes you want to be gender equal. And so, in a way, I could say that sex ratios are not confined to the emerging middle class or to the poor or to the rich. In our society, they tend to happen across, but a very substantial number of people in a very large class, when couples in that class tend to sex select, then they tend to skew the sex ratio. So I'll stop at, so what I'm saying is that, we need policies that work towards greater gender equality, and we need policies that lead to economic and social growth that spreads throughout the society. Now, to come to your second question regarding the marriage squeeze, I think the marriage squeeze is a most palpable and visible feature of the skewed sex ratio. And I think across the countries, China, India, there are a large number of studies that talk about the bachelors and the number of missing women in marriageable age cohorts. In India, my studies show that we have an ongoing marriage squeeze. So it's across the country, but it's especially bad in the parts of the country which have a terrible skew in the sex ratio. For example, in the north, Punjab, Haryana, the west, Gujarat, Maharashtra, etc. And there has been for the last 3 decades, at least, a marriage squeeze that is going on. Recent, and this marriage squeeze is not really expected to normalize until 2050 or 2055. And we'll be seeing the real consequences unfolding. We have already been seeing the real consequences unfolding of this marriage squeeze. A very recent PhD thesis I looked at showed that there were 129 males available for every female in the 20 to 24 age group. So that's a large number of men, looking for brides and not as many women there. And as men get older, the marriage squeeze tends to get worse for them. I think a lot of our data in China, India, etc., shows that it's also disadvantaged men who are not educated or who don't have jobs or who have a tarnished character or some other issue who tend to suffer more from the serious consequences of the marriage squeeze. So we have excess bachelors. We have, as Bjorn also mentioned, bought and trafficked brides. But something that I've studied recently, and in China they have looked at the plight of the bachelors and their parents. This is true in India too, and that's because of gendered roles. For example, when the parents grow older, they expect their sons to marry and bring in daughters-in-law, so that the burden of the household and the work and everything will shift to the younger woman from the older woman. Now, if the sons don't marry, the older woman and the couple continue to look after and do all the household chores and everything. And this, intergenerational contract that we have in Asian societies that children will look after their parents in their old age doesn't happen, because the crucial figure, the daughter-in-law or the wife, is missing because of gendered domestic and care responsibilities. So when we are talking about changing of social norms, I think this very hard to break domestic division of labor and care division of labor, which is actually across the world, except a little less in the Scandinavian countries, is something that needs to change. So, so what I'm saying is that these older couples, not just the men, but the parents of those men are also suffering. And so the marriage squeeze has consequences that spreads across society. We've talked, I myself have done a lot of work on the brides that are brought from other parts of the country who don't share the language, the culture in the regions that they are brought to. There is a resurgence sometimes of polyandry when wife sharing happens and all other kinds of things. No time to go into that. But I'll briefly talk about
maybe Ravinder, we can come back to the crime issues in the second round. Yeah, and you've covered so much ground already, in terms of the cultural drivers and the socioeconomic drivers of the practice and the aspirational nature of sex selection, but also what is going on with the very serious marriage squeeze. And if I heard you correctly, a really significant disparity between eligible men and women for marriage, which will go on for, potentially another 30 to 35 years. And that's a significant issue. And maybe we can come back to it in the second round when we hear from the panel again. But now, if we could turn to a video from India, if we could please have the India video.
कोई तो मेरे को कहता ये बेचारी की देखो 3 बेटियां, एक लड़का ही हो जाता तो मैं कह देती मेरे को बेचारी बेचूरी मत बोला करो। एक तो मैं बेचारी नहीं हूँ, मैं भी लड़की हूँ। मेरे को ये तो पता नहीं था 3 बच्चे हैं पेट में। तो डॉक्टर ने अल्ट्रासाउंड के बाद यही बताया कि फीमेल चाइल्ड है तीनों। तो लेडी डॉक्टर नाम तो नहीं मैं लेती, उन्होंने कह दिया कि ऐसे डिलीवरी जैसे करा देते हैं, अबॉर्शन कर देते हैं, बच्चे 3 पालने बहुत मुश्किल है। सुन के वो तो कहते थे हमारी 3 पीढ़ियों में बेटी नहीं है, ये 3 बेटियां एक साथ कैसे हो जाए, हमारे से तो पाली नहीं जाएगी, ये नहीं होएगा वो नहीं होएगा। बहुत कुछ सुनने को मिला मैम। उसके बाद तो मैं उधर गई नहीं, मैं नहीं गई। वो कहते अबॉर्शन करवा लो चाहे घर छोड़ दो, मैंने घर छोड़ दिया, मैं नहीं गई। पहले आपको पता ही है कितनी कम पे थी हमारी, इतनी छोटी सी पे में बच्चों को पढ़ाना खिलाना और घर की पूरी ज़रूरतें पूरी करनी, ये मेरे को होता और किसी का सपोर्ट भी नहीं। मेरे को अच्छा नहीं लगता किसी से एक पैसा भी मांगना, इसीलिए मैं कभी अपने भाई से भी नहीं कभी ऐसे किया कि मेरे को कुछ मदद करो। अब तो बहुत होता मैम, जब कोई रिस्पेक्ट देता, मेरे को कहते इसकी 3 बेटियां और अकेली ने पाली, तो मेरे को खुद को अपने पर के मेरे को भगवान ने इतनी हिम्मत दी। मैं पहले मैम मैं बहुत डरपोक और कमज़ोर होती थी। अब इधर सारी ज़िंदगी मैंने अकेली ने निकाली, बच्चियां को भी साथ रखा और पाली पढ़ाई। पता नहीं वो डर कहाँ गायब हो गया। मेरे को इन्होंने शक्ति दी, लड़कियां भी शक्ति होती मैम, मेरे को तो ऐसे ही लगता कि ये देवियां शक्ति है। कई बार मैं भावुक हो जाती हूँ, मेरे को पीछे की कमजोरी कई बार ज़्यादा आ जाती है और मेरी बेटियां मेरे को कह देती मम्मा रोना राना नहीं, दुनिया ऐसी है, निडर हो के रहो, दुनिया तो ऐसी चलती है। ये अपना फैसला है, बच्चा पैदा करना औरत का फैसला। परिवार चलो बराबर दोनों का, मियाँ बीवी का दोनों का होता, पर ये थोड़ी कि हम उनका ये फैसला माने कि इसको बच्चे को वोट करा लें।
तो आज भी हमें बहुत सपोर्ट करते हैं मम, कुछ भी करना हो, कोई भी काम हो, वो पहले पूछते हैं कि संदीप मनदीप प्रदीप ऐसा काम होने वाला है, हम ऐसे कर लें या नहीं। तो ये चीज़ तो मैंने देखा है लड़कों से ज़्यादा पूछी जाती है, लड़कियों की सलाह कोई नहीं लेता है, लेकिन हमारी मम सबसे पहले हमें पूछती है कि ऐसा होने वाला है, हम ऐसा कर लें या नहीं करें, आप अपना बताओ। तो बहुत अच्छा लगता है।
So, turning back to our panelists now and coming back to you, Dr. Hong. Your work has also focused on examples of positive deviance, just like the one we just saw in the video, where families and couples in areas in Vietnam which have very high sex ratio imbalance and very strong son preference have still chosen not to practice sex selection and to have girls. So why do some couples resist son preference and sex selection? And what lessons can we learn from this?
Thank you, Ingrid, for the question. Actually, a few years ago, we conducted a study to try to understand why some couple who have only daughter can resist the pressure from the people surrounding in terms of, having a son. That is a norm in Vietnam. A family must have a son, but there's couple who have 2 daughters or 1 daughter and stop striving to have son like other couple. So we found from our study that gender power relation is a key element. If the couple practice the equal gender power relation, then they could see they would share their perception about what does mean happy family or what does mean successful family. For them, the successful family is the family where where couple having mutual respect, sharing the household chore, and care about the quality of their children, regardless of son or daughter. They able to resist the pressure from their friend, from their extended family, or college, they neglect the mockery or teasing, and they can explain what for them is the most important. It's not about what people say, but it's about what they believe, what is good for them and for their children. We found that among the factor that's helping the couple overcome the pressure is the either equal relationship, but the most important thing to have an equal relationship is the women is independent. The independent of women is manifested in the independent in terms of income. She should have a good income. She should be able strong in her thoughts. She can make independent decision about what she wants. So education is important, as the Professor Ravinder just mentioned, and also economic conditions important. But what we found in Vietnam, that in Vietnam, highly educated women and well-off women as those who practice sex selection, right? But we found in our study is the education is important, economic conditions important, but women independence are the most important factor. The women independent get and combine with the equal relation between husband and wife are the most important factor to help the couple resist the pressure, because pressure from the people surrounds very very strong. And we found that those couple who striving to have daughter after to have son after having 2 or 3 daughters, because they cannot resist the pressure from their parent, from their family, from their friend. So we found at least 5 important elements that's helping couple resist the pressure. Is the first, the couple share similar perception about the succeed or successful family, or what is the mean happy family, and they mutually respect each other. They all weighted the quality of happy family with healthy, educated, and caring children over the matter of worship and lineage continuing after death. The equal relationship I mentioned, women independent I mentioned, and another factor is the separate living. Those couple who live separately from their extended family, particularly the family of the husband, from the very early of their marriage, is the important factor too. This condition support women to make her own decision, independent decision, and have less influence from the parent-in-law. And actually, the positive attitude of the external family also contributing to the success of the couple to resist the pressure. So the core thing is gender equality and women empowerment. I think these 2 key things that's helping couple practice, equal treatment to their children.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hong. And I think it's really interesting the way that you and Ravinder and Professor Lee have all been highlighting the importance of gender equality and women's education. And the mother's education, I think, also comes through very strongly. And it was quite interesting in the discussion we had last week, because the mother's education is also a strong protective factor for child marriage as well. So Professor Carr, let's come back to you. And your recent work has focused on the factors that increase the wantedness and value of daughters. And so can you just tell us a little about that, and also what you think the impact of COVID-19 might be on the lower value of and unwantedness of girls in India?
Thank you, Ingrid. So the study that I did recently tried to look at whether the value of daughters for parents was shifting. because ultimately it's the parents who decide whether they are going to keep a daughter or abort her. There are wider family pressures, definitely, but at the end of the day, the ball is in their court. And just as we saw in the documentary showed, it's the woman who decided to keep the daughters. So we divided, kind of our study into the facilitating changes that helped parents to think differently about the value of daughters, but also the persisting barriers. As we have noted that, son preference and GBSS has spread across the country in India. It's improving in some places, worsening other places. So one of the most important facilitating changes that we found, and it has many spin-off effects, is to come back to education. And because what does education do? That's what we tried to study. And what is very interesting is that India recently has what you could literally call a silent revolution in girls' and women's education. The increases in literacy, the narrowing of the gender gap, the spectacular entry of women into higher education. 47.6% of the students in higher education in 2017-2018 are women, and many of them are in the so-called STEM disciplines, science, mathematics, technology, etc. And what does education do? It is a transformative tool. It leads to higher aspirations, greater agency. We saw that in the young girls that you portrayed in the India video. And it brings them into public space, and it gives them a visibility. Girls going to schools, colleges, because public space and visibility were forbidden for women in our societies. And this brings them into to participate in various arenas of life which were forbidden. It takes them away from domestic work in the home and caring for their younger siblings, etc., etc. And so it has a very transformative role to play in bringing what Hong is also talking about, female agency. And I think the key factor is if education is able to bring about this female agency, then girls also become more aspirational. And as they get educated, they enter the work world, they tend to then contribute to familial family households, their own households. In a country like India, earlier girls were forbidden or their earnings were not used by the parents. And we found that parental attitudes were changing. Now girls were contributing to the incomes or the prosperity of their parental households. And that itself, leads to a very different way in which parents are going to look at their daughters. But I think what is really important to realize is that it isn't daughters rowing the boat by themselves. Parents, interestingly, are equally interested today in seeing that their daughters are aspirational, that their dreams are fulfilled to the extent that they can. I'm not saying there are no barriers. Girls do drop out of school. Girls, if incomes are less, and I'm going to come to that, I think is one of the key effects that COVID is going to have on girls' education. But what I found was that both girls and parents were negotiating with gender structures. And there is a slow improvement, especially in the middle class. And I think once that kind of a change occurs, it tends to percolate to the rest of society, as the South Korea example has shown. Now, to get back, to talk a little bit about the question of how COVID is going to affect the future of girls. And I think, unfortunately and sadly, we might see a reversal in the gains in education, or we might not see as rapid an increase as the path that India has been treading in girls' education recently. The restrictions that COVID has brought about, the lockdowns, the stay at home, the shutting of schools, etc., means that there can be greater control and surveillance now exercised over girls' mobility and action. Many of them may not be sent back to school once these lockdowns are over, etc. And what's also interesting is that, a lot of the learning is becoming online learning. And many more girls tend to go to government schools where the access to online learning might not be there. So in many ways, their schooling and their education is going to suffer. Also, poor and middle class, lower middle class families have lost incomes during this lockdown. And as we know that, girls and women are the first ones to suffer during economic crisis. And in fact, maybe the child marriage or early marriage, if girls are sitting at home and not going to education, a lot of our research shows marriage tends to get postponed if girls are getting educated. That might also be a setback. The last thing I would like to say is that, the pandemic has shown in many countries and in as developed a country as the US that the gender division of labor has been quite resilient. Women have taken on more, they've taken on the homeschooling, they've taken on extra cooking, chores, etc. And I fear that a lot of that load will again land up on daughters. And daughters will not go back into the world as they were doing, with the increases in education. So I think the higher levels of domestic violence can be faced not only by grown women, but also by young women and young girls. And that's another thing that I would fear. I really cannot think about what positive effects the COVID and the COVID lockdowns might have. So I hope that, things will come back to normal soon and we'll be able to go back to the kind of progress that we were beginning to see with girls in India.
Thank you so much, Professor Carr, and thank you for highlighting the impact of COVID, which I think we are seeing globally is not shifting the gender dynamics around women's unpaid care work, and I think we will see a regression in progress on many fronts as a result of that. So, Professor Lee, I'd like to come back to you for our final question. I think we've heard quite a bit about this in the panel so far, that there are really serious consequences of gender bias sex selection for individuals, for families, for communities, and for society as a whole. So maybe if you could just talk briefly about some of the consequences that have been evident in China, and also specifically, how can some of the cross-border impacts that we've seen with neighbouring countries like cross-border marriage best be addressed by a country like China?
Okay, Ingrid, thank you for raising this question. Because as China's SRB is getting back to normal, the society is actually getting more and more concerned about the consequences, demographic, social, economic, health consequences, especially among the other important issues like girls and women's human rights, survival rights, but also including some of the vulnerable people's rights, like the marriage squeeze and the related group of what we call the involuntary bachelors. This is a big increasing group in China. We estimate that by 2050, about 15% of men cannot get married. So the size will be around 30 to 50 million. And they are usually poor and rural and uneducated men living in the far and remote poor areas of China. And for instance, they are very vulnerable and on the bottom of the social class in China. For instance, that their life expectancy at birth is 7 years lower than the other regular married men. So these are what we call the vulnerable people in China. And we very recently, in a conference organized by Professor Carr, we raised a question about the family development risk for this kind of involuntary bachelors, including poverty, old age, security, marriage, and health. So with this kind of increasing and heightened, intensified marriage squeeze, of course, because China is developing very rapidly, so we see more and more cross-border marriage between China and the neighboring countries, including but not limited to Laos and Myanmar and Vietnam and even Pakistan recently. So this kind of cross-border marriage has spread from the border area of China into the inland area of China, spreading all over the China. So this is kind of also increasing concern and of Chinese society, especially during the COVID-19 period. in this year, and the Chinese government just drafted a new regulation about permanent residency regulation. So it caused a lot of heated debate about whether China should be open to foreign immigrants, and including the foreign marriages, cross-border marriages. So this kind of marriage is very complicated, including what I call the free and consensual, and introduced by himself, by other people, but also some kind of forced illegal marriages like fraud marriage and human trafficking. So the situation is very, very complicated. But luckily, and we were organized by the UNFPA China office last year, 2 years ago, and we did an investigation about cross-border marriage between China and Vietnam, but focusing on people in China side. And we didn't go to in Vietnam. But from what we found, observed in China, there are some of the positive impacts on the well-being of the both sides, from Chinese and Vietnamese. But still, we do observe a lot of negative impacts on the social integration, employment opportunity, identity, social status, social welfare of the foreign brides, and also to some extreme cases that also relate to the crimes and relating to the people in the both countries cross-border. So this kind of calls for a lot of international collaboration. So that at the end, this is a kind of natural phenomenon for the transnational and cross-border marriage in every country. But I think that this kind of gender bias selection related cross-border marriage in responding to the marriage squeeze in China and also other countries in the future. But China is a huge population, so I think the impact will be global. So at the end of our investigation, we proposed 5 basic rules for the international society, but also including Chinese government and Chinese society, including number 1, protect the rights. Number 2, promote social integration. Number 3, we have to improve the services and management from China side to the poor people and also to the foreign brides. And also we have to fight criminals and fighting against crimes from all countries. We also need to increase and empower the global cooperation and the governance. I think this will be, in the past, the only kind of issue between South Korea and other neighboring countries. But right now, because SRB is a global issue, marriage squeeze is a global issue, I think that this will be a global challenge, not only limited to China and the Chinese society, but also to the global society. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lee, and thank you for highlighting that this is not just a national issue for any country, but or even a cross-border issue, but is indeed an international challenge that requires global solutions. And also, for very large countries like India and China, what happens in terms of a marriage squeeze is not, we're talking about millions of people who are affected, and then that has a knock-on effect, of course, to neighboring countries. So I'm going to turn now to a video from our donor for the global program on gender bias sex selection in Asia, which is Norway. And I think this also highlights, some of the chat questions are asking what are the solutions, and also highlighting that we need greater investment. Well, I'm very pleased to say that we do have that investment for our region, including from Norway, as well as other donors who support this work globally and in the region. And so we're going to hear now from our donor in Norway. Can we have the Norway video, please?
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today, virtually. I wish I could be there in person. First of all, I wish to say congratulations on an excellent report. I read it with great interest. I appreciate so much the articulate human rights-based approach to every topic covered. I hope it's going to be widely read, I must admit. The focus of today's event is, sadly, no more missing girls and women. Fighting some preference is about securing women and girls. They are universal human rights. It's about the most basic premise that women and girls are entitled to the same dignity, human rights, and opportunities as men and boys. And in too many cases, it's about being entitled to the right to life. Some preference is rooted in social norms and traditions, but the economic component is also quite important. I find it quite precisely described in your report. I cite, "Some preference is a symptom of entrenched gender equality, which harms whole societies. The practice range from sex-selective abortions to neglect and killings of girls, and is also manifested by denying education to girls and allowing legal systems that discriminate against women. Globally, we have fortunately made a lot of progress. This is, among others, thanks to UNFPA and governments, civil society organizations, community leaders, and brave individuals. But we still have a quite long way to go, I would say. And the last lap will probably also be the hardest, especially now with the COVID-19 and all the backlashes that the virus has caused, also for this particular area. Last year, Norway launched a new strategy against harmful practices. It focuses on some preference and also on female genital mutilation and child marriage. With this strategy, we're stepping up our efforts, both in our development cooperation and in our normative work as well. We decided to support UNFPA's program called Addressing Gender-Biased Sex Selection and Related Harmful Practices in Asia. We signed an agreement with the UNFPA last year. Why did we choose UNFPA? We chose to support UNFPA's work for several reasons. The entire program is geared towards improving the human rights and opportunities for women and girls. It's on increasing their status. It's on reducing gender-based discrimination and violence through a transformational approach, which I really appreciate. The program has a strong focus on capacity development, on building evidence base, and on advocacy. And the advocacy work is both in terms of influencing policy and changing attitudes and behavior on the ground. It has a quite comprehensive approach of involving national authorities, media, and civil society organizations, and this is something we quite appreciate. It means that it builds on an idea that the program's efforts shall render sustainable results at national level. In addition, it seeks to increase the evidence base of what works to creating lasting change. And this, I hope, will inform national policies and also global policies on how to secure sustainable, transformational change that will last and make a difference. So you see, we have several reasons for wanting to invest in UNFPA's program on some preference. The program is also in line with SDG 5 on gender equality and empowerment of women. We cannot accept that millions of girls are considered to be of less value than boys, to the extent that they are neglected, subjected to violence, even murdered. The only way to achieve our goals is to work with partners who have the necessary expertise, networks, commitment, and persistence. We are proud to support UNFPA's work for women and girls that are being denied their human rights. We commend your hard work to fight gender inequality and structural discrimination, and your fight against some preference. Standing together, I am hopeful that we will succeed. Thank you.
And thank you again so much to our colleagues in Norway. So that was Margot Igland Skarpetig, and she is the Policy Director of Human Rights at NORAD. And we really appreciate the support of Norway for this global program on sun preference in Asia. and indeed also Norway's support to country officers in the region that are working on some preference as well. So with that, colleagues, let me turn back to our regional director, Bjorn Andersen, for his closing remarks. And let me also give my thanks to the panel for your great contributions. And actually you raised many issues that we could have discussed further in detail. And we did get some questions in the chat, which we can respond to after this call is finished. But thank you again for your contributions, and over to you, Bjorn.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. And dear panelists, really thank you from the bottom of my heart for very, very useful and very powerful conversations and arguments and discussions around this topic, which is very complex. And I think moving forward, the complexity of it, that it includes economic growth, it includes changing in terms of how people are moving within and between countries. It includes trafficking of women and girls. It includes norms and values, development of reproductive health technologies. It's a plethora of aspects which all of us, we need to be mindful of and understand. But it is, at the end of the day, important to see these changes step by step and do strategic interventions. It is about, advocacy at the global level, like has been pointed out. This is not the harmful practices, and especially gender-biased sex selection, is not isolated to any specific country. It is important to have a conversation across countries. It is important to work with governments at the national level, to institute a legal framework, to advocate for the importance for governments to make sure that women's rights or that women and girls can enjoy their rights, and making sure that they can access the information about their own rights. So both women's rights and the child rights are absolutely key in all of this. And then, of course, working at the community level in societies to change norms and values, and especially the views on women and girls. It's absolutely key. And that takes time, as has been said. And I think we also need to work together with everyone to explain why this benefits societies at the end of the day, to make sure that we can achieve gender equality, and also that women and girls can access their human rights. So it's a change from the top, and it's also a change which is needed at the community level. And at the end of the day, it is very much a question of what kind of societies we would like to have in our own countries and around the world. So with that, thank you again, an excellent discussion, and over to you, Roy.
Thank you so much, Bjorn, and thank you to all our fantastic panelists, and thank you to my colleague Ingrid as well. And thank you, dear audience from all over the world who have joined. I'm told we have a very good number in the audience, and we hope that you will join us again for our third and final special event titled the State of World Population Report. That is next Tuesday at 3 p.m. Bangkok time, when we will have three amazing young activists from three countries who will be speaking about the world we want. They are actually the ones at the forefront taking on child marriage, gender-biased sex selection, gender-based violence as well. And so we hope that you will be there for that, 3 p.m. next Tuesday. That's the 14th of this month, 3 p.m. Bangkok time. But, till then, thank you. Stay well, stay safe, take care. Goodbye from us all.